art, it's a free-flowing emotion, and our job is to capture it. We're taking a picture in time. What I think I really understood through the years is that wearing all the different hats is actually a superpower. Hi, my name is Ricky Damian. I'm a producer engineer originally from Italy, and we're here in beautiful Studio 13, Daman Albarn's studio, which I've been very honored to run and be part of the last 3 years. I started as a musician and played in bands for all my youth, and sort of got into engineering pretty young at the age of 14, 15, when I started assisting at the studio in my hometown, Treviso. And as soon as I got to understand what that world was about, I was pretty hooked straight away. I came here to study. I went to university here in London, and I pretty quickly got my head into the studios in town. As a young kid, you just want to be in the studio 24/7. And I landed a gig with a very, very amazing producer called Mark Ronson at the age of 21. At the time I started working with him, he was making his solo album called Uptown Special, which included the smash hit Uptown Funk, which I was fortunate enough to be a part of. And so I engineered pretty much everything that Mark did from 2014 all the way to the pandemic, 2020, while at the same time cultivating my own independent projects and my freelance work. And as a producer, I also have a lot of fun producing records, and I've produced albums for artists like Miso Extra, Nadia Kadek. I've produced some stuff with Sampha, with Jorja Smith. I grew up as a musician, and then I approached this world without really understanding what the roles were at first. And so I was producing everybody's shitty demos in my hometown without really realizing I was producing it. I was just a guy that knew how to record, or knew just enough to record, but I was always giving input like, oh, you could rewrite this part, you could add this, you could, layer this. I was producing records without knowing it. And so when I actually then, started doing this for a career, I focused primarily on engineering. I was really drawn to the technicalities of it. And in one way or another, I had forgotten about the fact that I was, in a way producing before. And when you approach this world and you're like a tiny little human that looks at the music industry, you go like, oh, I'm just this, I'm just that. What I think I really understood through the years is that wearing all the different hats is actually a superpower. And I remember when I was a kid in the studio in my hometown, there was a Soundcraft console that was not necessarily as legacy as like a Neve or a Forte or an SSL or whatever, but it did impact a different vibe compared to if I was brought up with just a mouse and a keyboard. I think it gave me a sort of like old school idea of like how things were made, and it was very fascinating for me. So every time after that, when I moved to the UK, that I actually went to studios, I was always looking for, what console do they have, this and that. And I remember the first time I got to see an actual Focusrite console. That was in probably 2017, 2018 in the States. That would have been the first time. Obviously, always been a fan of the idea, always been a fan of Rupert Neve and everything that he's done. So knowing that was one of the, effectively maybe the craziest console that was ever made, the type of facilities and the type of, things built into the console were at the time that it would have come out absolutely insane. So I had always been drawn to the idea, and I think the mystery of it, because there's not so many, and to this day there's only a few left. And so I remember the first time I went to United Recording at Ocean Way in Los Angeles, and I saw the one they have, the big wrapping one. I'm not sure how many channels, probably 96 or whatever, in Studio A, and we got to do a session there that was absolutely mind-blowing. I had encountered bits of that console in the past. I had used actual original ISA 110 preamps at Electric Lady Studios, or I think at Livingston Studios here in London they have some, at the church here they have some. So I was always like, you have some Focusrite ISA stuff, that's amazing, blah blah blah. And so I was always drawn to the sound and even the ergonomics. I think there's a musicality to it, not just the sound of the pre, but like even the EQ points, the way the EQ works. I was always very, very attracted to that sound and the ergonomics of it. And even in the studio where I grew up, we had some 115s and 131s that were heavily used on a lot of stuff. So I remember it was a very it was an epiphany when I actually got to see the console and use it for the first time. It was absolutely mind-blowing. When I think of ISA, I think of two things. I think of like beautiful musical sound, open, nice, grand, But I also think about flexibility. This is a Swiss Army knife. And there's a variety of applications that I always see that fit. You know, I personally carry one of those in my mobile rig, which is a 16-channel rig that I take everywhere, and I do a lot of location recording. Sometimes, you know, I take a project with a band and we go into like a barn or a house or somewhere like that is not a recording studio, and that's really like the centerpiece of this. And I've relied on it for, you know, a decade at this point, and it's never failed on me. Not only it never failed, but it actually delivered me exactly what I needed. But it's also a perfect tool for keyboards, for example. Like every time I build a synth rack or something like that, I very often bundle a DI to a Focusrite 828, because it's the perfect 8-channel situations where you just have all you need from the front. You can, you know, inject more stuff from the front if you need to, so you actually have 4 more extra things you could add. And honestly, you could just have a very, very solid sound on a relatively small setup and have, you know, 8-channel of great sounding pre ready to go at any point. So the two things for me are the sound and the ergonomics of it. They're 100% killing it. It's not a coincidence that the best sounding preamps in the world are not the new ones. And there's something to be said about the legacy of Rupert Neve and what he's done. I think we're talking about something that is now 40 years old, which is crazy to say, but it is so much about the heritage sound of certain pieces of equipment. So for me, like, I know that when I want to have a recording session or a production session, when I record stuff, I know that almost mathematically, putting stuff through stuff that sounds heritage and sounds vintage and gives me that real sound makes a huge difference. So if I'm not in the studio, usually I rock with this. So every time I'm not in the studio and I'm doing something location, this would be the sort of default setup for me. Even just recently, I had the chance to bring this on the road for a live performance of Sampha and Romy. That was done at the Young Space in East London, and got the sound straight away. Everything was on the same pre, which is something that I like. I could play with the impedance of some of the ribbons that I had for room mics and stuff. And once it was all dialed in, you know, the performance could happen and there was no work to be done on my end. So it's a very plug and play scenario as well, which I quite like. If one option is better than the other, and then, you know, the music speaks for itself. So I quite liked the straightforwardness of that. Being able to travel with something that is as high quality as possible in terms of preamp sound, but also lets you have all these manipulation tools for the variety of inputs you might have. I just couldn't think of anything better personally.